In section number 3, we're going to look at authoritarianism. Now, authoritarianism is any type of government that is run by a dictator or an oligarchy or somebody that a group of people that do not allow their own people to have freedoms, that control the lives of the citizens of the country. This can happen in a lot of different forms. It can happen with communism, socialism. It can happen with monarchies. There is a possibility that it could happen with republics, but again, that would mean that the rule of law would have been overturned within those countries, or that the laws had been changed to such an extent that there were now groups of people who were being targeted by those laws and by that government. What we're about to discuss is actually one of the most difficult things to talk about, simply because everybody is working off of different definitions. So how many times have you heard somebody on television or somebody in the media say that such and such is socialist, or that such and such is fascist, or this is communist? It's really, really difficult to know if they're working off the same definition that you are. What we need to do is to try and define these terms in a way that we know exactly what is meant when that term is used. So let's look at socialism first. Socialism is really an economic system. Now, it could also be defined as a political system, because the economics of the country start coming under political control. You could also make the argument that it is a social system as well. Whereas when we're talking about a republic is just the political system. And then free market capitalism, that is the economic system. And then the idea of individual rights or individual liberties is really the social system that's in play there. So there are 3 different things when we're looking at a place like the United States. But if we're talking about socialism, the political, the economic, and the social are almost married to a point. And so we have this one word that kind of defines all 3 of these things, and that's where a lot of confusion can develop. So the first thing that you have to understand with socialism is you need to know the term means of production. The means of production are the raw materials, the money, the labor, the machinery that goes into creating a good or a service. So we're talking about the economic here. In a socialist system, some of the means of production, or the method for creating the products or the goods or the services, are owned entirely by the government. So we're looking at key industries are going to be owned by the government or government run. What this means is that if you were looking at healthcare, and you were saying that there is a socialist healthcare program, what that means is that the hospitals are going to be government owned. The doctors are going to be employees of the government. The radiology equipment, the MRI machines, everything that is needed for a hospital and for doctors to perform their tasks are owned by the government. So what would happen is your taxes are going to pay for all of those things. The government is just going to take your taxes and then create all of those resources themselves. This is different from, say, something like Obamacare. Obamacare is not a socialist system. It's actually a welfare system, in that the hospitals are still privately owned. The doctors are either working for themselves or they're working for a company. The health insurance industry is still owned by shareholders or by individuals. And what is happening is the government is taxing the people and then subsidizing the healthcare. And it's highly regulating the healthcare or health insurance market. But the health insurance market and the healthcare markets are not, in fact, owned by the United States government. That's why it's not socialism. It's better defined as welfare statism. That is your main difference between the welfare state, or what we call democratic socialism, and socialism in its true form. To where did socialism spread during the 20th century? If you look at the name USSR, that stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The reason why it's the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is because under Marxism and Leninism, they had not achieved what was needed in order to have a pure communist state. What they instead had was a socialist state where the means of production for basically everything in Russia and the other 14 Soviet republics was owned by the government. So your apartment building was owned by the government. You were assigned an apartment. You were assigned a place to live. You might even be assigned a job. That's very possible, because one of the things that they did during Stalin's rule was to take people out of the rural areas or out of the countryside and move them into the cities in order to work in the factories. So pretty much everything in the Soviet Union was run by the government. And that's also why I would say that it's not just an economic system, it's also a political system. What we tend to see happen in socialist countries is that the Socialist Party cannot compete against other parties. And so what they end up doing is, when they gain power, usually through some sort of violent revolution, they outlaw other parties. So they become a single party state. And so what happens with socialism is you often get this, rather than just being an economic system, it also becomes a single party state political system as well. Because really, once you've lived under socialism, you would understand this is not really what you want to live under. One of the great examples that I like to give is that in the United States and in other countries, we build walls to keep people from getting in, whereas in the Soviet Union, they built walls to keep people from getting out, because they didn't want to have a mass exodus of population. And so that's why the Berlin Wall was built. That's why there was so much fencing between the Iron Curtain countries and the Western countries. It was to keep those people from being able to move to the West. And so we saw socialism started in the USSR with the Russian Revolution in 1917. Then later on, we saw the socialists, or what we call the Chi-Coms, the Chinese communists, fighting against the nationalists in China. And Mao ends up defeating Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek and his followers flee to Taiwan and establish their government there. But mainland China becomes what we call communist, but is really socialist. We saw domino theory in effect when it spread from the Soviet Union to China and then down into Vietnam. And that's the reason why the Vietnam War was fought, was to prevent communism or socialism from spreading any further, from spreading into Cambodia, from spreading into Laos or Thailand and taking over Indochina. We saw socialism in Angola, in Western Africa. We've seen a lot of leftists in Central and South America, especially Central and South America. You've seen it in Bolivia. We've seen leftists in Brazil. We've seen leftists in Argentina, in Venezuela, currently in Nicaragua. So there are lots of places that socialism has spread to. And whenever there's been a revolution, forgetting one of the biggest ones, Cuba, whenever there's been a revolution, it's always been about taking the wealth or taking the property of the wealthy and redistributing it to the poor, and the promise of a better life in that way. But the problem is that socialism is not necessarily married to human behavior. Yes, we do want better for ourselves, And some of us are willing to take it from others at the point of at gunpoint, but you have to realize what are the consequences of those actions. When you drive away the people who produce things, the people who make capital in your nation, then what you're really going to end up doing is leading your nation down a path to where they become very poor. We've seen this happen in Venezuela. We've seen it happen in Cuba. We've seen it happen in many, many places. The Soviet Union was never able to compete economically with the United States because their economic system was inferior to that of the American system. No matter what our faults are or no matter what faults capitalism or free market capitalism has, every political system has faults. Free market capitalism is still the best thing that we've got. So that's why we've seen so many failed states coming out of socialist countries. Now you might say to yourself, well, look at China. China's doing very well economically, but China had a reckoning back in the 1980s and 1990s. They saw what happened to the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union's economy collapsed. So the Chinese government actually started moving towards more of a free market capitalist style economy. Now, is that to say that it's been completely shut off and that the state doesn't own anything and the state doesn't interfere whatsoever in the economy? No, not at all, because the Chinese Communist Party does interfere in the economy. You've seen the video of all the ghost cities in China that have been created out of nothing for no reason, and that was to basically inflate China's GDP and make it look as though they were doing better than they really were. That still happens, and it's an inefficient use of resources, and trust me, we're going to talk about the use of resources at length once we get to econ. So I'm going to try to keep this as much to political and social as I can, but you can't just get rid of the economic part and just focus on that social and political. Now, here in the United States, we often call socialism communism. Again, it's because all of these states that have gone to socialism have been modeling their economies, their ideologies off of the Communist Manifesto, which was written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And so we tend to call these countries communist when really they are socialist. Marx saw an evolution in economics. We started with feudalism, and feudalism developed into capitalism. And then he believed that capitalism would develop into socialism, and eventually socialism would develop into communism. In communism, he has 10 tenets, which you're going to read in the Communist Manifesto. And once all 10 of those tenets were put into place, and as Engels said, the walls between nations broke down or withered away, then you would have communism as an international workers or labor movement, and there would be no nation states. You would only have the workers, and basically the entire population would simultaneously be in all control of all of the goods, services, raw materials, all of the capital within a nation. Then coming along with that, there would no longer be a state. There would no longer be a government. That's what a commune is. It's a group of people that are working together, but this doesn't work on a large scale. You can't take it from small scale and scale it way up because it just doesn't work that way. It can work in a small Israeli kibbutz where people have decided that they want to work together and they're going to give away some of their rights to the group, but we don't see this happening in more than groups of, say, 20, 50, or 100. It just doesn't scale up because that's not the way that the majority of humans think. That's not what our behavior is. So that's the reason why it just doesn't work. And again, this leads us back to why are the two terms confused so often? It's because the name of the book by Marx and Engels was the Communist Manifesto, and all of these all of these leaders, whether it be Lenin or Mao or Castro, they're all following Marx's playbook. And so they're all Marxists. And because they're Marxist and Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, we tend to label them as communists, even though they're really socialists. Now, one of the things that you definitely want to know with socialism is it tends to come with serious political ramifications. There's an old adage or an old maxim that states that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So power corrupts a person, and when a person gains total power, then they're completely corrupted by that power. And we see that with whether it's Castro, Lenin, Stalin, looking at Maduro in Venezuela now, Chavez, who came before him, Pol Pot in Cambodia. You look at Mao in China, you look at any of these guys, and what did they do once they came into power? They wanted to consolidate their power, and they wanted to maintain their power. And in order to be able to do that, they had to be very heavy-handed, which means that many people died, or many people were thrown in political prisons. Many people just disappeared and were never heard from again. So if you look at the Soviet Union, we know that between 20 and 60 million people were killed or disappeared by Stalin during his rule from 1924 to 1954. We know that upwards of 50 million Chinese died during Mao's rule, be it from the starvation that occurred because of the movement of people from the countryside to the cities, or because of the consequences of the Cultural Revolution. We saw 1 to 2 million people killed by the Khmer Rouge when Pol Pot was the leader of Cambodia. Cuba, the numbers aren't quite as high, but we do know that there are a lot of political prisoners in Cuba who are rotting away in jails simply because they didn't like the Castros, because they wanted something different than what the Castros were offering. And so that is something that really comes part and parcel with socialism. You're generally going to tend to get these despots who understand that in order for them to maintain control, they're not going to be able to allow free elections. So they're going to have to use the power of the government, or they're going to have to use force in order to maintain their hold on power. And so that's really what you want to understand about socialism. We're going to next look into communism. So with communism, we're looking at the Marxist-Leninist way of doing things. Again, Karl Marx being the Marxist part, and Vladimir Lenin, the man who was responsible for the Russian Revolution in 1917, being the Leninist part of that combination. So Marxism-Leninism is taking the two ideologies that are very, very similar and pulling them together. Karl Marx, German, wrote the Communist Manifesto in the 1840s. And it is going to be a revolutionary piece of work, but it's also a very dangerous piece of work because of what he advocates for in order for communism to come about. In order for communism to come about, people have got to be deprived of their rights. Those rights are going to be given up. And this is this is the reason why it's not popular in the United States, or it hasn't been popular up until this point. So, according to Marx, how are economic systems supposed to evolve? We've covered this in socialism. It starts off with feudalism, then it moves on to capitalism, then on to socialism, and then on to communism. And remember that communism is, in Friedrich Engels' words, supposed to be stateless. States are supposed to wither away. You're just supposed to be left with the labor pool, who is then in control of all. And there is not to be any private property. So the answer to who is in charge, there is no one in charge. There is no government in charge in communism. That's what separates it from places like the Soviet Union and China and Cuba and Vietnam and Cambodia. Those countries all had heads of state and heads of government. Whereas with communism, according to Engels, all of that is supposed to wither away. Now, one of the things that Marx advocates for is for the abolition of religion. He calls it the opiate of the people. Now, remember that opium is a drug that is made from a poppy seed, and opium is something that puts you to sleep. So we get morphine from opium. And the way that Marx looks at religion, think about this. If you are somebody who is very, very poor and you don't have much going for you, then one of the places that you can always turn to is religion. Because one of the things about Christianity or Islam or Judaism is that no matter what your life is like on earth, you have hope for the afterlife, because you have the promise that you are going to be with God in the afterlife. And so what it does is it allows people, it gives people a kind of a therapy to be able to get through their days and to get through their lives, with the understanding that even if I suffer in this life, I'm going to have a good afterlife. And so Marx calls it the opiate of the people because it's like a drug, and it's putting people to sleep, and it's shutting their eyes to what their real situation is like. So he advocates for abolishing religion. But one of the things I'm going to talk about all throughout economics and when we're in this section is that communism often overlooks human behavior. And one of the things that humans are looking for is answers. We want to know what comes next. We're always searching for meaning in our lives. So if you take away religion, then you have to ask yourself the question, what is this life? Is there really any meaning to it if I'm just a collection of dust? And so what religion does is it gives people that hope, and it gives people that not just this, it gives them the answer in their search for meaning, that my life is more than, or I am more than just a collection of dust. I am something that was created by a higher being, and I am important to that higher being. And trying to eliminate religion is just going to go against human nature. And people are not going to let go of their religion, even if you force them to at gunpoint. And so, again, that just demonstrates one of the problems with most of communist thought, is that it just goes against human nature. Now, in your reading, you're going to read about the 10 planks of communism, so I'm going to leave the 10 planks to you to find in your reading. Now, again, the last question on this is, what does communism ignore? And again, it goes back to communism ignores the idea of human nature, that I want to make my life better than what it is now. I want to have a better life than what my parents had. I want my children to have a better life than what I had. When you have communism and everyone is equal, but we're not talking about equality in law. We're talking about equality in opportunity. We're talking about equality in outcome. Whenever you have forced equality, what that means is that you cannot do any better. And when you can't do any better, you have very little incentive to go out and work harder to make your life better, because whatever you do to make your life better is going to be taken from you by the state, or is going to be taken from you because you're not allowed to have private property. So this is one of the reasons why we have seen communist movements, Marxist-Leninist movements fail, or why we have seen Marxist-Leninist countries fail. It's because they always ignore human nature. Now, one of the key terms that you got, or one of the key phrases that you guys need to know, is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So I think that all of you would agree that some people are better in academics, some people are better in athletics, Some people are better with music. We all have different talents. We all have different things that we understand and that we grasp better than other people do. Now, let's just say that you're sitting in your American government class and you get your test back and you get a 90 and the guy sitting next to you gets a 20. Okay? In a capitalist system where we look at rewarding those who work hard and those who are talented, then those are the grades that would stand. In a communist society, what you would be looking at is we're going to take those 90 points and those 20 points and we're going to put them together. So it's 110 points. And then we're going to split those 110 into two equal parts, 55. And now both of you get a 55. Well, what does that tell the student who got the 90? That tells the student who got the 90 that, hey, there's no reason for me to work harder because no matter how hard I work, I'm going to have to give up some of my points to somebody else. Now, what does that also tell the student who was on the receiving end of those points? It tells the student on the receiving end of the points that there's no reason for me to work any harder than I already am because I'm going to get points from somebody else. And so the next test, neither of them works as hard. And so now instead of splitting 110 points, maybe they're only splitting 80 points. So both get a 40. And what this demonstrates is what happens in a communist society. If you have no reason to work, if you just have to reach your quota for the day, you are working in a sprocket factory and your job is to make 100 sprockets in 8 hours and you can make 100 sprockets in an hour, then you just quit making sprockets after that hour and you go take the rest of the day off. Because you know that if you make 800 sprockets or if you stay and work overtime and make 1,200 sprockets, it's not going to make a lick of difference. You're going to end up with the same as if you had made 100. So what it does is it disincentivizes hard work and it disincentivizes creativity and it disincentivizes the drive to go out and do better. It disincentivizes ambition. And so that's the reason, again, why communism doesn't work, is because it disincentivizes all those things that make a society better. When an inventor makes a product, yes, he is benefiting himself by making something that's going to earn him money, that's going to earn him capital, which is going to allow him to go and make even more things. But what's often forgotten is when that person makes something, then the reason why he made money off of it is because there was demand for that product. It made somebody else's life better or easier. And so by making somebody's life better or easier, you have obviously made their life better while at the same time earning money that makes your life better. And this is the part that communism just doesn't get. So make sure you read those 10 planks of communism and fill in the rest of those questions on this slide. All right, so now we're going to go back and look at a little bit more of the history of communism. I'm going to expand on what I just said in the last slide. So in 1917, remember that Russia is involved in World War I. And it's not going real well for the Russians. The Germans are definitely, if not defeating the Russians, they're definitely fighting them to a stalemate at the very least. The Russian people, the thing you have to remember about Russia is it is still what we would call a feudal society. So when I say a feudal society, it's an oversimplification of the idea of an economic, political, and social system that existed for what most of us think as the Middle Ages. But that Middle Age way of living still exists in a lot of Russia. So you have serfdom in Russia. You have people that are just a step above slaves in Russia. You have more than, I would say, probably 97, 98, 99% of the population is just surviving. Whereas the 1% of the population is thriving. They're living, you look at the Tsar and the winter palace that the Tsar lives in St. Petersburg. It's beautiful. It's expansive. It's a gorgeous place to live. But that's not how most of Russians are living. Far from it. And so there's this movement within Russia to reform. And one of the leaders of the reform movements was Vladimir Lenin. Now, Lenin had been exiled to Germany because of his beliefs. He was a Marxist. He wanted to see an overthrow of the Tsar and have the Tsar replaced with a communist government or a socialist government. During the war actually gave him cover to be able to get back into Russia. So he reappears in Russia and immediately starts finding his followers. People like Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin. People that are going to be very important when the Soviet Union comes into existence. So he is able to gather up what we call the Red Communists, or what they called the Bolsheviks. Bolshevik in Russian means majority. And so the Bolsheviks, they believe that they had the support of a majority of the Russian people, and they want to seize power from the Tsar. And so they began an insurrection against the Russian government while the Russian government is trying to fight the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottomans. And so there's very little ability for the Russians to be able to counter what's happening. You also have other competing groups. You had what we call the white communists. Don't know a whole lot about them, but you do need to know that the communist movement within Russia was split into two camps, the Reds and the Whites. Then the white communists had allied themselves with another group of people, and then you also had the pro-monarchists, or the classical conservatives, that were trying to keep Tsar Nicholas in power. Nicholas and his family end up getting seized by the Red Communists and are sent to, I believe it was Yekaterinburg, don't need to know that city, in the middle of Siberia. And eventually, the Red Communists understand that in order for them to maintain power, they are going to have to kill the Tsar and his entire family. And so that's what they do. The reason why they do this is as long as that family is alive, then there is a threat that the Romanovs or the Romanov family will have supporters who will continue fighting to try and put them back onto the throne of Russia. So the entire family is murdered. You may know of the story of Anastasia Romanov. She is said to have escaped the slaughter. There were women who claimed to be Anastasia Romanov throughout the 20th century. There were dental tests run. There were fingerprint tests, or whatever types of tests that they have to determine if any of these women were actually Anastasia Romanov. And it turns out that all of them were fakes or hoaxes. But going back to the Red Communists, once the Romanov family is out of the picture, the Red Communists are going to be able to run the country and start to solidify their power. And the leader of the revolution, Vladimir Lenin, ends up becoming the leader of the new Soviet Union, which is incorporated in 1921 or 1922, one of those 2 years. But Lenin is going to end up dead in 1924. And there's going to be a struggle between Trotsky and Stalin. Trotsky ends up losing. Stalin becomes the new premier of the Soviet Union. Now, one of the things about revolutions is they generally tend to eat themselves. Think about the French Revolution. What happens to Robespierre? Robespierre ends up having his head taken off, even after he has taken off the heads of 18,000 people as part of the Committee on Public Safety in the Reign of Terror. And so Trotsky, knowing that his life is in danger, flees to Mexico. And Stalin is going to be looking for him for the next couple of decades. Stalin is going to take over in the Soviet Union and is immediately going to begin what we call 5-year plans. And 5-year plans are these economic plans to try and modernize the Soviet or the Russian economy. Because as I mentioned earlier, the Soviet Union or Russia was a feudal society. Most of the people were based in agriculture, and very few people had any more than what they needed to survive. And so he wants to modernize the industry of the Soviet Union in order to be able to compete with the Germanys, the Britons, and the Americas of the world. The problem with these 5-year plans, again, is that they don't go based, he doesn't design them based on sound economic principles. He designs them based on communism. And so he decides, I'm going to move all of these people from the countryside into the cities, and we're going to rapidly industrialize. And they do rapidly industrialize, but at the same time, millions of people starve to death because there's now not enough people in the fields to make food. Because the Soviet Union didn't have all the mechanization that a place like the United States had. The United States has tractors. The United States has technology that we're using in order to harvest massive amounts of food. So we don't need that many people working in the fields to be able to feed our own population. We actually have extra food. Where does a lot of that extra food actually end up going to? Ironically, we send a lot of our extra food or surplus food to the Soviet Union because a lot of their people are starving. So he institutes these 5-year plans. There's a couple of 5-year plans in a row. Millions of people end up dead because they starve to death. And let's just say it's not going well. In the meantime, Stalin is able to find Trotsky. This is like 1946. Trotsky's hanging out in Mexico City, and Trotsky ends up being murdered by the Soviets in Mexico City. So he's still trying to take out his political rivals even 20 years later. Something Stalin is also famous for is for not just having you murdered or sent to a gulag, it's for completely erasing you from history. So there's an interesting photo where you can see Stalin around a table with 3 or 4 other men. And then as each one is executed, he has somebody doctor the photo to take that person out of the picture. By the time Stalin's done, Stalin is the only one at the table because he's murdered everybody else that was there with him. Stalin was incredibly paranoid, and this is again one of those things that we see from dictators, is this paranoia that somebody else is looking to take their power and is going to be do anything they can to take that power. Now again, remember that this happens in 1917. In the 1930s, Mao Zedong is fighting Chiang Kai-shek for control of China. And in the 1930s, they kind of call a truce because in the 1930s, Japan invades China. And so instead of fighting each other, they start using their resources to fight the Japanese. Once World War II is over, they go back to fighting each other. Now, Mao uses the same tactics as what Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin did, and that is to tell everybody that if you support us, then we will. Mao and the communists end up defeating Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. And as I said, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists flee to Taiwan and set up their own government there. Mao takes over the mainland, and what he immediately begins doing is using propaganda to ensure that he is the supreme leader of China. He almost acts as if he's a god. The Chinese have something called the Little Red Book, and it's just this, what it says, a little red book that has all of this information in it that Chinese people are supposed to learn and put to heart. And it's about how Mao is like the savior of the Chinese people, and it's all about their ideology, and it's really just propaganda. So if you look at a similar situation in North Korea, when Kim Jong-il was alive, the North Korean news agency used to put propaganda out like he was the greatest golfer alive, like he was better than Tiger Woods, and that the first time that he ever went to a golf course, he shot a 37, which included something like 11 holes in one. They also believed that, his father, Kim Il-sung, also basically said that he was a god, and that because he was a god, the North Koreans had to follow him. Then that divinity was then transferred to Kim Jong-il, and then eventually it was transferred down to his son, Kim Jong-un. So getting back to what's important with this domino theory is that you've got the Soviet Union fell in 1917, China fell in 1947, and then North Korea, or the Korean Peninsula, is going to fall into war in the early 1950s. The North Koreans are going to align themselves with the Soviets and the Chinese. The South Koreans are going to align themselves with the West. The entire Korean War ends up basically being a draw, and the border goes back essentially to where it was before the war started. So by the early 1950s, you now have the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea have all fallen to communism. And then domino theory is going to continue in Southeast Asia with Vietnam. Vietnam had been broken up into the North and South Vietnam, with the North being ruled by Ho Chi Minh and the South being ruled by a man named Diem. Diem was supposed to hold free and open elections in South Vietnam, and then realized that he didn't have the votes, so he stopped the elections. When he did this, the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese communist sympathizers, called the Viet Cong, went to war against the Diem government. Now, at that point in the 1950s, the French were actually the colonial power in that region, and the French are the ones that started the Vietnam War. It was the Americans who ended up getting involved in it once the French left. And the reason why the Americans got involved in it was to try and stop the dominoes from falling in Southeast Asia. Because the theory was that if Vietnam falls, then you're going to lose Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, eventually maybe Myanmar, and the communism is just going to continue on spreading. So this was a battle of what we call the first world versus the second world. The first world being the democratic world where open elections are, where people enjoy individual freedoms. Then you had the second world, which was all of those countries that were dominated by communists or under Soviet influence. The third world, which we now refer to as those countries that are poor, actually means the group of countries that were neither aligned with the United States nor were they aligned with the Soviet Union. Going back to the very last question on the slide here, we were asked, how did most people die under communism? Most people died under communism because of starvation. The 5-year plans, the Great Leap Forward in China, they ended up moving so many people out of the countryside and into the cities to work on industry that neither the Soviets nor the Chinese were able to produce enough food to feed their own people, and that's how the majority of people died in the 1950s. Now, going back real quick to the Cold War, I just want to touch on mutually assured destruction. Mutually assured destruction has to do with the United States dropped the atom bomb on the Japanese in 1945, or the 2 atom bombs on the Japanese in 1945. Once the rest of the world saw that the United States had the atomic bomb, it became very clear to the Soviets that they were going to have to also invest in nuclear weapons as well, because if you have one nation that has them and one nation that doesn't, the nation that doesn't have them is vulnerable to destruction from the other nation. So the Soviets invested most of their resources into weaponization, specifically into creating nuclear weapons. So by 1953, the Soviets had their own bombs. And now we're in an arms race to build bigger and better weapons. So the weapons that we have now are unbelievable in their power as compared to the one that was dropped on Hiroshima back in 1945. You're talking about weapons that are potentially thousands of times stronger than the first atom bomb. And so if one nation were to launch their nuclear weapons against the other, then what would happen is that the other nation would also launch their weapons against the aggressor. And so because we both had thousands of weapons, we're talking about 15, 20,000 weapons apiece, we were talking about each country destroying the other. And so this is the idea of mutually assured destruction. There are some in the political science community that laugh at the idea of mutually assured destruction, but it is actually the thing that kept the balance between the United States and the Soviet Union and prevented either one from going to war against the other. And considering how deep the animosity was between the two nations during the Cold War, it's surprising that we didn't end up going into war against each other. We only fought proxy wars against each other in Korea and in Vietnam. Now, we had some political stuff involving Afghanistan, the Olympic Games in 1980, the Olympic Games in 1984, but we never actually came anywhere close to destroying each other, at least on purpose. There was one incident where it almost happened accidentally, but we're not going to worry about that right now. Again, neither side wanted to die, and that's the reason why the nuclear weapons were so important. They prevented both countries from going into a physical shooting hot war, and they also kept us from blowing each other up, because we understood that if one side launches theirs, the other side is also going to launch theirs. Now, the revolution in Cuba, we need to get into that just a little bit. I'm going to give you a real quick background on this. In 1959, Cuba was the most prosperous Caribbean nation that there was. And it was doing pretty well, but it wasn't necessarily doing well for everybody. As with a lot of Latin American nations, you had some people who were very, very, very rich, but then you also had some people who were very, very, very poor. And so Fidel Castro decided that he wanted to start a revolution against the president or the leader of the nation at the time, a man named Fulgencio Batista. Now, Batista was backed by the United States, but as with most things in either Latin America or the Middle East, you have a bad option and you have a worse option. Batista just happened to be the bad option. He wasn't a great person, but at least he wasn't communist, is the way that we looked at it. So Castro, with the help of Argentine revolutionary Che Guevara, lead the revolution. They promised that once the revolution is finished and once Batista is gone, that all of the land will be taken from the wealthy and redistributed amongst the poor. Again, we see this over and over and over again with communist or socialist revolutions. And then Castro comes into power, and he immediately sets up, just like any other communist or socialist government does, he eliminates all opposition by making other political parties illegal. He begins to imprison dissidents, people who disagree with him. And I don't know that there was a whole lot of executions going on in Cuba, but there were a lot of jailings because of people's different political views. Now, the Cuban Revolution had a serious impact on American politics, because Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So it's very, very close. And what happened is, because the Cubans were communist, they aligned themselves with the Soviets. And at one point during the early 1960s, Fidel Castro decides that he wants to allow the Soviets to put nuclear weapons into Cuba. And those nuclear weapons, of course, are going to be within range of Washington, D.C. So John F. Kennedy, who was the president at the time, could not afford to allow this to happen. So he came up with the idea of quarantining the island of Cuba. And basically, it was a blockade. We just called it a quarantine because a blockade is actually an act of war. And so what we did was we denied access to Cuba, or we denied Russian ships the access to Cuba so they could not bring nuclear weapons into Cuba. This was probably the closest that we ever came to getting into a war with the Soviets. Fortunately, the Soviets backed down, and the United States agreed to remove its nuclear weapons from Turkey, which is right across the Black Sea from Russia. We did try to remove Fidel Castro at one point. The CIA, or the Central Intelligence Agency, led an invasion of Cuba, and it became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. It did not go well at all. What the CIA did was they trained a bunch of Cuban nationals who had fled to the United States following the revolution. And the CIA, along with those Cuban nationals, went into Cuba to try and remove Castro. It did not work out. And the end result was that we made an agreement with the Cuban government that we would never again try to remove Castro from power. What we have done is we've put sanctions on Cuba. So we have not allowed any exports to go into Cuba until just recently. That policy changed in the year 2014 or 2015 when President Obama lifted some of the export sanctions off of Cuba. What this means, if you've ever seen pictures of Cuba, the one thing that you're really going to notice is the cars. So all of their cars are from the 1950s. There's a reason for that. We stopped exporting cars from the United States to Cuba once the revolution had taken hold. And so all of the cars that are left in Cuba are cars that are now 60 or 70 years old. The Cuban people, to their credit, they keep them running and they keep them looking good, and they're very, very proud of their cars as well. Now, moving on to those people who want to leave Cuba. They will often try to reach the Florida Keys or Miami by crossing the Straits of Florida. And again, that's a 90-mile journey across open water. They will use anything that they can to escape Cuba and get into the United States. During the 1960s, thousands upon thousands of Cubans came to the United States to escape the revolution. In the early 1980s, there was an event called the Muriel Boat Lift, in which a lot of people met at the port of Muriel, and the Cuban government actually allowed them to leave the island at this one time. And so this was called the Muriel Boat Lift, when a bunch of Cubans fled Cuba legally in order to get to the United States. Now, for a long period of time, the United States had a policy called wet foot, dry foot. And what this did was it allowed any Cuban who set foot on dry American land to remain in the United States. They were granted political asylum. Any Cubans that were caught in the waters would have been sent back to Cuba. So that's what wet foot, dry foot is. You get 1 foot on dry land, you're allowed to stay. But if you're caught by the Coast Guard or you're caught by the Border Patrol in the water, then you're going to be sent back to Cuba. So another one of these Latin American countries that was very prosperous is Venezuela. And the reason for Venezuela's prosperity is the vast oil reserves that Venezuela sits on. But just like any country, and especially any Latin American country, there's a large disparity between rich and poor. And so this disparity between the rich and poor, the gap between the rich and poor, made socialism very attractive to some people in the population. And in the late 1990s or early 2000s, a man named Hugo Chavez runs for president of Venezuela with the promise that if he is elected, he is going to correct that imbalance. Now, the way that he was going to correct that imbalance was to take land from the rich, give to the poor, to institute minimum wages, to institute price ceilings, and basically to interfere in the inner workings of the economy and in the society. And again, this was very attractive to somebody who has no money or to somebody who is very poor and wants what somebody else has. And so Chavez begins all of these reforms. He also reforms the Constitution so that he can continue being elected president over and over and over again and ignore the term limits that were in the Constitution. So he's basically setting himself up to be a dictator. Now, when he did all of these things to the economy, he basically sank Venezuela's economy. It went from being the strongest economy in all of South America to now one of the weakest. you're sitting on billions of barrels of oil, and you've got people who can barely eat, or who have nothing to eat at all. That doesn't make any sense. The reason why this happened is because number one, he started nationalizing a lot of the private industry. So if Hilton had a hotel on the beach in Venezuela, he nationalized that hotel. He basically kicked the Hilton Corporation out, told them to go away, go back to the United States, and then he had the government running that hotel. Now, one of the things that we know about government versus private industry is that government does not tend to do things as efficiently as private industry does. Then he nationalized the oil companies. And so now the government bureaucrats are running the oil companies rather than people who actually know how to run an oil company. And so they started losing money. They started losing profits from not selling as much oil as they used to. There is a Venezuelan equivalent to Best Buy. And so he saw that the TVs that were being sold by this Venezuelan equivalent to Best Buy were way too expensive and the poor couldn't afford them. So he told them, you cannot sell these TVs for more than this amount. And what they did was they set the price so low that it incentivized everybody to go out and buy one. But the company was losing money on every television that they sold, so they ended up going out of business. Same thing happened with grocery stores. The prices were set to a point where the grocery stores couldn't make a profit. Therefore, there was no reason for them to sell. And so Venezuela very, very quickly ran out of toilet paper. So think about what happened during the pandemic when everybody was frightened and everybody panicked at the beginning of the pandemic and ran out and bought toilet paper. Well, the same thing happened in Venezuela, but the difference is that they did not have the supply chains needed to replenish the supplies of toilet paper. So there was no toilet paper in Venezuela. It got so bad in Venezuela that people actually started going to local zoos and killing animals in local zoos in order to have something to eat. Now, once Chavez died a few years ago, his vice president, or whatever he was called, Nicolas Maduro, stepped in to become the president. Now, the interesting thing about Nicolas Maduro is that in his previous life, he was a bus driver. Well, let me tell you something, guys. You don't necessarily want a bus driver running your country, because he has managed to run Venezuela's economy completely into the ground. They're experiencing hyperinflation, and the money that they print is essentially worthless. Now, because of the similarities between the governments of Venezuela and Cuba, they developed a relationship in the early 2000s where they would trade wherever they needed. So the Cubans are noted for having medical facilities. The Venezuelans had oil, so there was an exchange of things along those lines. And they both hate the United States, so that gave them another reason to come together. Now, you're also, again, going to need to know some of the world leaders. Three of the major socialist or communist nations right now are China, Cuba, and Venezuela. And so you need to know that the leader of the Communist Party in China is Xi Jinping. You need to know that the Cuban dictator is Raul Castro, who is the brother of Fidel Castro. And then you also need to know that the Venezuelan president is Nicolas Maduro. And you want to pay attention to what's going on in Venezuela right now, because that's going to have a lot of influence on what we talk about in economics. So two more important leaders that you're going to need to know are Kim Jong-un of North Korea and Nguyen Phu Trong of Vietnam.